Perhaps I can just say something now too about the prayer and prophecies this week. I hope very much that you have appreciated being led in prayer together. And I love the times when we prayed, for instance, with all the mics open, and it's a foretaste of heaven, isn't it? I love hearing people pray in different languages. You may not understand all the words, but we do feel the Spirit's anointing. And the prophetic words have been very powerful and weighty in our view. And behind the scenes, I need to tell you, there's been a lot of communication going on between the prophetic team and those of us who are leading the conference, just to try and bring the right things in at the right time. But these prophetic words that we've had, as John King just testified, have been very powerful and weighty in our view. And I want to tell you what we're proposing to do. First, we will be getting a small apostolic and prophetic team together just to go through the words and weigh them and talk and pray about what God is saying to us. We'll then be meeting as an international team. They haven't heard about that meeting yet, but we will then be meeting as an international team to consider how each of us handles these words in our different spheres. Salt and Light isn't a top-down hierarchical ministry. That's not the way we work, but we're a family of apostolic leaders and spheres who work together, but who also help one another. So we want to talk and share about how we handle these words that we've received from God in our own spheres. For instance, if we're thinking about Myanmar, churches in India have been very involved, churches elsewhere have been very involved. I happen to have been a couple of times as well. So there are different people involved. So how we work together and try and follow these words through is quite important. So each sphere leadership will want to look at these words and say, how does this apply to us in our team and sphere? What is God asking of us as a result of these words? One of the things that always, impacts me is, if God speaks a word to us, it's very encouraging, but it actually leaves us with quite a responsibility. It's not a light thing that God has spoken such weighty words to us. It means he wants us to take responsibility for certain things that he's saying to us, and so we need to do it. So thirdly, eventually we will publish the prophetic words that we have heard over this week on the website. This may take us a few weeks as we want to process them first. So if anybody sort of starts thinking, where are these words? They will be coming through, but if you could just give us a little bit of grace and patience. Now, some of the words are strongly directional, and they demand a leadership agreement and response. And some of them are encouragement, which is more personal in nature. And therefore, each of us needs to hear them and respond to them. For instance, when I hear leaders moving, it's time for leaders to move, I have to ask myself, is that us? And Lorraine will nod at that because she asks it faster than I do. Is that us? Should we be moving on or moving into something fresh? And fourth, the international team will come back to them over the next couple of years and seek to evaluate how we're doing in building on them since the conference, so that we're accountable to what God has said to us. If I could just talk a little bit about the ministry that we've had over this week, because it's been rich, and it's like almost every devotion, every session that different people have spoken to us in, we have had some significant teaching and input, no question about it. I know when I go to conferences like this, it's possible to feel a bit overwhelmed by it all. I mean, for instance, do you even remember what was said on the first day? It can be a challenge, but I encourage you not to feel like that. Our next conference will probably be in a couple of years' time, I guess. We haven't decided that yet. So you do have time to work some of these things out. So let me just say a couple of things. First of all, everything is recorded. Do listen again yourselves, but also play recordings to your teams. Now, the great thing about this is that no session was longer than 30 minutes. Now, that's been a miracle for most of our conferences. I mean, and those of us who've been together for years think that is absolutely amazing. I'll tell you what has really impressed me on this conference is that most of us stuck to our time. So the age of miracles is not past. But what it means is if you want to listen with a team, it's not a long, very, very long teach. It can be something that you can listen to and then discuss together. So do listen to them on a personal level, do listen to them on a corporate level, because I think there's lots of good stuff there. I want to encourage you to try to respond to any God moments for you. The final session that we did each day was all about leadership, from Rick Thomas encouraging us on the first day to stay emotionally healthy, and from Steve J talking to us about Steve Jones talking to us about being magnanimous and understanding others who are different from us, from Joman and Sunita talking about working in teams. So question is, what is God saying to us individually and corporately about these things? Other parts of the conference were about post-COVID church. What sort of church should be coming out of this period into the next period? And frankly, if we've got a new phase, what things would we want to leave behind, and what things do we want to take up into the next phase? Working virtually, living relationally, establishing our discipleship culture, and church planting. And weren't Rich and Kate right in our faces when they talked to us about that? Now, these all need evaluating in our leadership teams. Perhaps you could play just one of these recordings per month over the next few months in your team and see what God says to you together. We have time to listen carefully to what God's saying and to seek to respond. And finally, the ministry that we've received from Roy and John about wanting to see God's multiplication process in us as we make disciples who make disciples is something we need to pray about, work on, train in, and pilot with others. And we need to approach this with faith and with creativity and be willing to experiment, even fall flat on our faces, because most of us leaders have learned most of what we know through making mistakes. So don't try and avoid any mistakes. Don't be afraid of it. Let's go forward. Let's experiment again, and let's move in faith towards God. And just sort of to conclude this time, if you think this ministry and some of the big things that God has spoken to us about is too big for you, let's read a scripture together as we conclude, which may help to posture us as we seek to draw to a conclusion and to head on forward to seek God's kingdom wherever we are. And I've entitled what I want to say in this just next few minutes as a ministry too big for you. Most of us are engaged in a ministry that is too big for us. If we think about some of the calls we've heard from God, some of the things he's called us to over the years, it's most of it too big for us. And we think, it's a bit like Gideon, who was spoken about earlier this week. God is with you, mighty warrior. He didn't feel like a mighty warrior. He didn't look like a mighty warrior, and he wasn't behaving like a mighty warrior, but God was going to make him a mighty warrior. And that's the sort of call that we have. But the passage I want to read is from Mark chapter 6, and I'm going to read this story of the feeding of the 5,000. Mark chapter 6 and verse 30, the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they'd done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they didn't even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place, but many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time, it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," they said, "and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "That would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said, 5, and 2 fish. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven. I love that little phrase, and looking up to heaven. He gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of men who'd eaten was 5,000. Well, the apostles returned to Jesus excited about the ministry that they had seen. They'd seen tons happen, and they reported to Jesus what they'd seen happen. They were excited about it. Actually, in some ways, Jesus wants to get them out of the excitement, because effective ministry is not rooted in excitement, but compassion. As Doug told us yesterday, there's a mixture of eagerness and perseverance, but not excitement. But actually, when Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion out on them, and that's when this next piece of the ministry came forth. And they want Jesus to send the people away to get sorted, and Jesus says, "You feed them." Well, now it's fairly obvious to the disciples that the ministry is too big for them, and their resources are far, far too small to deal with it. So we're told at the end of the story there's 5,000 men there. Just how it was in those days, the men's heads were counted, but not the women and children. But if you consider there's always more women and children in the crowds, this is at least 12 or 13,000, probably more. And it's very clear, and the disciples say, "No, Jesus, we can't do this. This is 8 months' salary for one meal for these people. No way can we do this." And Jesus says, "Well, let's just have a look at the resources." And what they find out is they have 5 barley loaves. It doesn't come out clearly in the version that I read, but 5 barley loaves. This was poor man's bread. This wasn't even decent bread, if I can put this that way. This is the sort of diet bread of the poor family. So there's 5 barley loaves. And I was reading a sermon of Charles Spurgeon's on this, and he said, 5 barley loaves and 2 anchovies. Well, when I read that, I thought, I'd even seen 2 sort of bigger fish, that had come out of Lake Galilee or something, because 5 loaves, 2 fish. Well, when you think about it, 2 big fish aren't enough. We understand that, but when Charles Spurgeon preached on, he said because what people used to do was they would have a basic loaf and they would have a little spicy anchovy to spice up their sandwich lunch. And when I picked that up from Charles Spurgeon, I thought, oh, this is worse than I thought. I mean, it was always bad, but this is worse than I thought. And one of the things that sometimes confronts us is the numbers of people around us, the hardness of people's situations, the pain that they're walking through, the brokenness that we touch in people's lives, the family challenges, social problems, ethnic issues, crime that we're facing, COVID pressures, mental health issues, etc. How are we going to touch all this? Well, the answer in this story is it takes a supernatural touch. The disciples bring these meager resources to Jesus, and Jesus takes them, and in the master's hands, they are multiplied to feed many. Now, when we receive call to ministry, when we receive call to lead God's people, when we receive calls to multiply, something within us cowers back in fear. We can't do it. Some of us have been leaders for years. Maybe our churches have been static for too long. The size of the task needs to drive us to lift our eyes to heaven. And I love that even Jesus, it's like, does he really know what's going to happen? Well, I don't know whether he did or he didn't. But he took these meager resources that were brought to him, and in the master's hands, these meager resources are multiplied to feed many. Now, we've been talking about multiplication. We can't do it. But Jesus can, because Jesus is the God of multiplication. He looks to heaven and multiplication happens. And so in the midst of these calls that we've heard this week about what is God is calling us to in multiplying disciples and in post-COVID church, and as leaders ourselves, something within us knows that our resources are very meager. The thing we need to do is to bring our meager resources and put them in the master's hands, because Jesus is the master of multiplication. And our response to all that we've heard this week has to be a response of faith. Of course we can't do it. Of course we don't have the skills and abilities. Of course we don't have the resources. Of course. The call of God is way, way beyond us, but our meager resources put into his hands are multiplied to feed many. And one of the precious things when you've worked for God, fascinatingly for some years, is people sort of feed back to you. You know, you did this for me 20 years ago, or you said this to me, or you did that. And look, it changed my life. This is what happened. And you keep on getting letters and notes saying from people, this has just been amazing. And you didn't know that you even had anything to do with it, because you were simply putting your resources in Jesus's hands. And the only strategy that we need is how to distribute what Jesus is touching and multiplying, because Jesus is in charge of the multiplication. But what I notice is there's more left after the master's touch than existed before. And this supernatural touch comes as we give everything to Jesus. What do you have? 5 loaves, 2 anchovies. We give them to Jesus, just like Non prophesied yesterday about consecration. As we give everything to Jesus, he's able to multiply the meager resources that we have. You're hungry for his touch as we go away from this conference, I trust so. I hope you heard things and think, yes, my heart's crying out for that. Healings, deliverances, new birth, the kingdom unleashed everywhere around us. And Jesus said the kingdom is near. It's not far away, it's near, and it comes to the hungry and the thirsty. And if we'll hunger and thirst for this kingdom, God will multiply our meager resources to see it released. And as JB said to us a couple of days ago, he said, it's time to seize the kingdom, the violent take the kingdom. It's time to buy the pearl. It's time to sell all and get the treasure. Make the kingdom our focus of priority, our obsession. And I want to encourage us at the end of this time to give our meager resources to the multiplying ministry of the Master. I was reminded as Doug was speaking yesterday from Isaiah 54. When I heard Doug open Isaiah 54, my heart leapt. Many of you know that this has been a life message for me, but it was William Carey who preached from this passage many years ago, 300 years ago, with this great phrase: expect great things from God, attempt great things for him. Faith is the key that unlocks the resources of heaven. It doesn't depend on who we are, it doesn't depend on our meager resources, but putting all our trust in the multiplying hands of the Master. God bless you as you go away and seek the kingdom and pray for it to be unleashed everywhere that you are through all that we've been hearing on this conference. Let's move in faith and obedience and see our regions, our nations transformed. Ingriza, back to you.
Thank you so much, Steve. Before we began this conference, there was a question that Dave Oliver asked Steve. And the question was, if this conference is going to be a success, what's that success going to look like for you? My issue is, I wonder how God feels, at the end of these days with our time together. And I wonder how you will feel, when we meet him about our time together and what we will have done about what we heard in these 4 days. Let me read a scripture to you. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron and his sons, saying, this is the way you shall bless the children of Israel. Say to them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So they shall put my name on the children of Israel, and I will bless them. The Lord bless you and keep you, and may his name be upon you until we meet again. God bless you. Bye-bye.
Amen. Amen. Bye-bye.